So the first question we ask, is there really a God? Evidence for a higher power. We all know this passage out of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And we have to come to him in faith if we want to please him. And it says we have to believe not only that he is, that he exists, but also that he rewards those who try to find him, that diligently seek him. And those who seek after him, he will reward, and those who don't will not receive that reward. So I said last week that we're going to start at ground zero. If you were an alien dropped on this planet and knew absolutely nothing about anything, or if you more realistically are a person who was brought up in a secular world, in a secular family, who really has no understanding of anything religious, right? Where do I go? Where do I start? Is this all there is to life, you say, as you go about your job and your entertainment, your fun and your toys? Is this really all there is? And you have to start out searching for this God. You say, I think there might be a God out there. There has to be more to life. There has to be something else, but I need to figure out who it is. Where do you start? And that's kind of where I want to start out this quarter, beginning today. Yes, we have to come to him in faith, but we have to know where to place that faith. And we have to be confident that the God or the deity that we place our faith in is worthy of our faith. So the first question we ask, again, we introduced this last week, is what? The most basic question you can ask, is there a God? I guess there technically could be a more basic question, right? Do I exist? I'm going to start with the assumption that yes, we exist. And unless you are some back in school, you always knew who the philosophy majors were, right? Back in school and college, because they were always asking the dumb questions. Is the word real? Do I exist? Are we just a computer simulation or a hallucination floating around in somebody's mind? I'm going to assume that we actually exist today. If you're not sure that you actually exist, either here in the auditorium or watching on the internet, I would like to propose an experiment to you. Here's an experiment. I need you to go to your bank first thing tomorrow morning. I need you to withdraw everything in your savings account and put it into a cashier's check and email it to myself, care of Bible Baptist Church. Because if you don't exist, then you don't need your money, because your money probably doesn't exist either. If you don't need your money, you might as well send it to me. Do I think that anybody will take me up on the experiment? Probably not, because deep down you know you exist, right? You take care of yourself, you eat, you sleep, you buy a house, you have a job, and you save money in your savings account so that you, who exist, can use it at some future time. So I'm going to assume that all of us exist, the universe exists, and because it exists, and we are here and we can think, we ask this question: is there a God? There are three possible answers to this answers to the question, logically speaking. Those three answers are what? Yeah. Yes, no, or I have no clue. Okay? If your answer is no, that makes you an atheist, right? I believe there is no God. The universe formed itself. The origin of life is completely spontaneous. And we are all just kind of here for no particular reason. And asking why about anything is kind of a pointless question, because there is no why. It was all random. Other people come to the conclusion that they say, well, I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But we really have no way of knowing if there is or if there isn't. If that is you, then you describe yourself as an agnostic. I really don't know if there's a God or not. If you find yourself as an agnostic, good news, you're at least thinking through and asking the question. You're on the right trail. You're seeking for that God. You say, something is telling me there might be, but I have no idea how to find him or how to track him down or how to know him in any way. You have a ways to go if that is you, and hopefully this class will maybe help you out with that. But at least you're asking the right question and you're searching for him. The other answer is yes, that there is a God, and that's what I think the conclusion we're going to come to, but we're going to start examining this week and next week. God, as I said, left clues to himself throughout the universe, and he kind of assumes that agnostic starting point, really, doesn't he? Many people throughout history have not had the scriptures to just turn to And many people for whom the scriptures have been written throughout history didn't have an easy access to the scriptures. And so he leaves his clues elsewhere. He doesn't rely solely on his word to bring people at least to the knowledge that there is a God and that we need to seek him. Perhaps the best evidence for the existence of God is the created universe in which we live. All of us here probably know the verses. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 3 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." It says all you got to do is walk outside, look into the heavens, the stars, the creation, look around. It screams that there is a God, that there is a creator. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. What does that mean? Every time you look outside at the sun, moon, stars, everything you see outside, it's screaming, it's pouring out speech, it's speaking to you, saying there is a God somewhere. Somebody put this together. It says there is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Everybody, everywhere in the world, no matter what language you speak, what time you were born in, as long as you're a person and you have eyeballs or even ears or senses of any kind, you can see or sense that there has to be some being that put all this together. Romans chapter 1, verse 20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." In other words, again, you look out at the creation and you look around and it just says there is a God. And so the people who say there is no God, this last phrase here in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, "So they are without excuse." And in context here, this is talking about the people who have rejected God. And he's saying, look, these people go outside and they look around at the sun, moon, stars, the plants, the animals themselves. Everything just demands a creator. And so those who turn away and say there is no creator, it says they're without excuse because they have had all the evidence they need to, at the very base level, bottom, say there is a God somewhere. So if you come to the conclusion there is no God, you're without excuse. You will not stand before him someday and say, "I had no idea, God, that you existed. I didn't know. How am I supposed to know?" Even if you have no access to scriptures at all throughout your life, at the very least you can come to the conclusion that there is a God because of the creation we live in. Now, in our society, the biggest opponent to the existence of a creator is what? The theory of evolution. And in our modern times, people have come up with a way to rationalize away and say, I see the creation, I see the universe that we live in, and yet we have come up with a way to explain God away by finding an origin for the universe that doesn't require a God, right? Essentially, the debate comes down to one underlying assumption, okay? And this is logical. Follow with me here. Either A, somebody made it, or B, nobody made it, right? Those are the two logical options, correct? If I'm missing something, let me know. But as far as I can tell, either somebody made it or nobody made it. Now, think this through with me here, okay? This is the basis of what we're studying. Now, if no one made it, then someone could not have made it, right? Does that make sense? You with me? And that's the basis of evolutionary thinking, right? If we can explain away so that nobody made it, then that by definition means that somebody, God, didn't make it. And so as long as I follow the evolutionary model, I can disregard the God because I no longer need the God, because the God did not make the universe. And so we don't need him. We can show up and function without him. On the other hand, if someone made it, the universe, then the creation proves the existence of the creator. In other words, if I say somebody clearly had to have made it, then that demands that there is a somebody who made it. So either somebody made it or nobody made it. If nobody made it, then somebody could not have made it. But if somebody did make it, then we have to figure out who that somebody is. Everybody on board here? Are we okay? All right. So, the question then becomes, does the universe, the evidence that we see, does it support a random, self-generating universe, or does it support an orderly, designed universe? So our job then is to look at the evidence that we see all around us and evaluate it and say, what does this evidence tell us? Does it suggest a creator, or does it suggest random natural events? Before we dig too deep into this evidence, I want to give us a couple cautionary thoughts here. Sometimes we, in our zeal, jump ahead a little bit too far, and we want to be strictly logical as we follow this, right? This is going on the internet. It's open for everybody to see. We're not just talking to a bunch of believers here, potentially. And so we want to stick to logic and rationale, because that's how we will be graded by the secular people. Here we go. Caution, true or false? What do you think? Evolution is the only valid scientific explanation for the origin of the universe. Would this be true or would this be false? I would submit that this would be false, and we're going to look at the information regarding that here shortly. Next one's a little bit more difficult. Number 2, creationism is not technically scientific because it cannot be observed or repeated. Why do you think I put this question in here? Have we heard this question come up before? Yeah, in the debate of should we allow creation into the science classroom at school? This is what they always bring up, correct? Creationism, you can't teach that in the science class. Why? Well, because it's not scientific. Science, by definition, is what? It's observable, it's repeatable, you have to demonstrate it over and over in a laboratory setting or in some kind of experimental setup where you demonstrate that a scientific fact is fact by, again, experimentation, data collection, result, right? You form a hypothesis, you test it, you repeat it, you test it again, you experiment with it. Once you get repeatable evidence over and over, it can be peer-reviewed and repeated by other people. Then it becomes scientific, and then you can put it in the science classroom, right? And because of that, creation, quote-unquote creation, if there is a God, is not what? It's not observable, it's not repeatable, you can't test it with experimentation. So, the question, true or false, what do you think? Creationism is not technically scientific because it cannot be observed or repeated. What do you think? Ruh-roh. Now we have a problem, don't we? Can you repeat creation? I sure can't. No. Oh, so maybe creationism shouldn't go in the science classroom? Is that what we're saying? Let's ask one more question. See how we do on this one. Evolution is scientific because it has been observed and repeated. Well, wait a minute. If we're going to hold creation to this high standard of scientific definition, we should probably be consistent, shouldn't we? So, evolution, can it be repeated? Can you replicate the origin of life in a laboratory? Can you demonstrate that the historical, possibly quote-unquote, events of the random origins of life in ancient prehistoric Earth, the macroevolution of one type of animal to another, has this been observed and or repeated? Can you demonstrate in a laboratory that that's the way it happened? Evolution is scientific because it has been observed and repeated. What do you think? False. It's no more scientific than creationism is. Both are a study of the origins of the universe and of life. Both of them claim to know how things happened way back when, but neither of them can repeat those original events. So, if we kick creationism out of the classroom, we should also, by definition, also kick what? Evolution out of the same classroom. Of course, you and I both know that's not how it works. We apply the standard to one and not to the other. Really, what creationism and evolutionism is, both of them are like forensic science. Do you know what forensic science is? Everybody's seen how many spin-offs of CSI or what's the other lab show? There's another one, NCIS or something like that. Anyway, lab shows, right? And these lab shows, however many different franchises of them are all about, there's a crime somewhere before the episode takes place, right? They discover the dead body or whatever the crime is, and then the forensic scientists come onto the set and they do what? Come on, you all know what this is. What do? Oh, you people are horrible. I can't even hear you. What they do is they take their little laboratory toys, right? Their scientific instruments and their little mobile boxes. They take their fingerprinting and their DNA sampling stuff, and they go out to the scene, and they try to gather evidence from the scene, and they take it back to the lab, and they throw it in their instrument, and sure enough, before the next commercial break, their instrument pops out the answer, and it magically tells them what happened in the crime, and they can rule out this guy, and this guy, and this guy, which takes you within 2 minutes of the end of the episode. Then they finally focus on the right guy and bring him in, and he confesses, and they put him in jail, right? I've worked in the laboratory for quite some time, and I will not name names in case you're watching, but I used to have a boss that thought that laboratories should work just like CSI, right? And he'd hand us something and said, "Here, figure this out." And I say, "Why don't you just figure what this is or what it contains? What do you mean just figure it out?" "Well, that's how on CSI they do it all the time." Well, okay, CSI is a TV show, right? Yeah. TV shows also have Superman and Marvel Comics, and that's not how the world works either. They're both on the same level of accuracy, right? But the point is that forensic science, let me ask it this way, is forensic science actually science? What they're doing is trying to demonstrate what happened in the past and come up with the scenario of event that cannot be repeated or observed. Right? They're trying to determine what happened in the past regarding an event that cannot be repeated or observed. Is forensic science a science? What do you think? Oh, it's so quiet in here. Sometimes I miss my little classroom upstairs where we can interact better. I really do. So is forensic science science? Yes and no, kind of depending on how you look at it, right? Forensic science isn't trying to repeat the original event. They're trying to use scientific testing, which is repeatable and observable, to determine what happened in a past event that is not repeatable or observable, right? We're not trying to recreate the crime. We're trying to figure out what crime was originally committed by using scientific methods that are repeatable in a laboratory, right? How many fingerprints can you run and always identify it? That's repeatable. How many DNA tests can you do and always repeat it? That's scientific because it's repeatable. But we're not trying to demonstrate the test. The test is just a vehicle for us to figure out what happened in the past. Evolution and creationism both are a grand-scale forensic science, right? You try to use scientific observation and methods to determine an unrepeatable event that's in the past. So in that sense, is our creationism and evolution scientific? Well, yes and no. The original events are not repeatable. But the evidence that we look at is easily repeatable, easily peer-reviewed, easily demonstrated in a laboratory. We just have to figure out what that evidence suggests, right? Which brings us to the next question. Evidence for evolution far outweighs any evidence for creation. Kind of a trick question, isn't it, really? I kind of like how Ken Ham described this. He points out, and I don't remember where it is or what video or book or whatever, but he says it's kind of a false question because really evolutionists and creationists both happen to live on the same planet. And I'm kind of paraphrasing here, he doesn't say it exactly like that, but we look at the same rock layers, we look at the same fossils, we look at the same living organisms that are in existence today. We look at the same sun, moon, stars, universe. We are looking at the same set of evidence. We're using the same data set. The only difference is the conclusion that we come to. The evolutionists say, I see this data set, that would be the world around us, and it clearly points me to evolution. And the creationist looks at the exact same universe and data set and say, aha, this clearly points us to creation. So is the evidence for evolution outweighing any evidence for creation? In other words, does the evolution evidence outweigh the creation evidence? False. It does not. It's the same evidence. It is the same evidence. The only question is what evidence does that draw us, to what conclusion does that draw us? The same evidence, creation or evolution. Whew. Everybody with us okay? This is not your typical Sunday school lesson, is it? And if you're out there watching and aren't really familiar with us, usually we use the Bible a lot more than this. These next couple of weeks will be a little bit uncharacteristic because we're starting at ground zero. We haven't really decided if this Bible is trustworthy yet here in this study, right? This church, yes, we have. I mean, we got that settled. But for the purposes of this series here, we haven't come to the point yet where we can trust our Bible, right? We're starting at ground zero. So that's why we're not using it a whole lot today. This is not typical. Usually we use it quite a bit. All right. If you're okay with this, we're going to continue on. What all this tells us, ultimately, is that evolution attempts to explain the existence of the universe by using the very laws of nature that declare it to be impossible. And that's what we're going to look at as we go through some of this evidence, right? Evolution says, aha, the universe formed strictly by the laws of nature and scientific, stuff. The laws of nature, the laws of physics and chemistry and all that kind of thing. And that's what formed our universe. And yet, as you look at those laws and how they tend to behave, it doesn't really seem to bring you to the results that evolution claims that it would. They restrict themselves to the natural laws, but you look at the natural laws and they say evolution can't really happen. Creation, on the other hand, says that the laws of nature declare the universe to be impossible to have happened by itself. And then it looks to the supernatural as the only logical explanation of our existence. It says, look, I don't believe the laws of nature could have accomplished what we see around us. Now, if the laws of nature could not have done it, if nobody couldn't have made it, then somebody had to have made it. And that demands the existence of a creator. Everybody with me so far? Everybody good? It's awfully quiet, but again, this is the auditorium. Nobody's allowed to speak in the auditorium. All right. We have a little bit of time left. Let's start here. The origins of life. This is a big, deep question. Where did life come from? I have a picture up here of one of the simplest forms of life that I could think of, that I could come up with. It's in existence today. This is a single-cell organism called an amoeba, right? Everybody's heard of the amoeba, and when you're taking biology in science class or whatever, and they want to go to a simple, early, primitive life form, this is kind of where they take you. It's about as simple of a life form as you can have and still have life as far as the cells that we see in our natural world. This is one that's been, it looks like it's on a microscope slide in some laboratory. They have stained it, gram stained it or whatever they call it, to make it show up pink. They're not actually pink unless they get sunburned. Just kidding, they don't get sunburned. But this is in a lab, that's on a laboratory slide. They've stained it. You can see the different, it's kind of a blobby shape. It's all pink. It's got a couple little dots in it and stuff like that. That's what an amoeba looks like. Here's actually a textbook diagram of that same organism. And you can see it's kind of color-coded a little bit. It's got some different dots in it. It's got a few labels there as far as different parts and pieces of this amoeba. The question that we will have to ask ourselves is, could this amoeba, this little life form, have happened randomly over millions of years from organic molecules on ancient Earth? Could this have happened by mistake, by natural laws with no guidance? That's the question. Have anyone here ever built something kind of from scratch? Now, I'm not talking about some kit that you buy at Lowe's and have, some assembly required. That's difficult enough because you pull out the Chinese written instructions and nothing makes sense. And it's difficult and you can't figure out if slot A goes into slot B and all that kind of thing. That's difficult. But a step beyond that is try to make something where you're not even provided with slot A or tab B, where you're making the parts and everything from scratch. Has anybody tried to do that before? With anything? Oh yeah, the dead stairs, I got you. Okay. I heat with wood at our house, and because I'm cheap, I don't want to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a wood burner. I like it to be outside, and those are super expensive. And so what I do is find somebody that has a used indoor wood burner. I convert it to a boiler to heat water and pump it into our house. And that's how we've heated our house for the last 15 years or so, okay? Well, last winter, the one that we were using rusted out because it wasn't designed to hold water. It was supposed to be a forced air unit that I converted into a boiler. So I went out and fortunately happened to be able to find another one that was identical to the one that I had before. So all I had to do is reconvert this one the same way that I did the old one. But it takes a while because it's not really designed to hold water. And to convert it to a water jacket system, I have to make everything piece by piece because it's obviously not a kit that they sell pieces for. So every plug, every fitting, every pipe, I have to cut, and I have to, at least I can go and buy the pipe. At least that's good. I don't have to make my own pipe. But I have to, all the caulking, every joint, every seal, every screw, every fitting, I have to weld or solder or glue or something together. And even as something as simple as that takes a long time. It just takes a while because every single piece you have to start from scratch. We look at things like amoebas and life and plants and animals and stuff, and it's easy for us to overlook some of the detail that goes into creating something like that. And so I thought, what better way to look at the origin of life than to find the most simple cell that there is and say, could this have just kind of accidentally popped into existence the way that evolution claims that it did? So I went to the same textbook that I got the diagram out of, and I put a list of the different parts of the amoeba up here. Keep in mind, this is one of the simplest cells that you find, and it's got at least all of these parts. So let's go through these one by one and kind of look and see how likely it is that these could have come to be. First one, the structure of the amoeba. That's not really a part, but it's a unicellular animal with pseudopods that lives in fresh or salt water. Fine. The next piece, the pseudopodium, part of the amoeba that is used for locomotion. Now, if you were trying to create a cell, and you say this cell has to be able to get around, it has no propellers, right? It has no jet propulsion, or, it's not a jet ski. How do you allow this thing to move? How are you going to create something that allows us to move? Now, we can't just say, it has this piece and it moves and then move on. I mean, planning has to go into it. It has to work. You can't just put some jelly in a jar and expect it to move, right? How are you going to go about creating a cell that moves? Anybody? Apparently you can because it happens. We can look at them in the laboratory. I mean, I understand what you're saying, right? I'm not trying to put you down. I don't know how to do it, right? Obviously it can be done because somebody or something has done it because we see amoebas and they move. So if we had to create one of these, how would we go about it? Well, I looked up some descriptions of these different parts. It says the pseudopodium, in order to move using pseudopods, the organism pushes cytoplasm, we're going to cover that in a minute, towards one end of the cell, which makes a projection or a pseudopod off the cell. In other words, the cell squeezes itself together, sends out a little, not a sucker, but a little arm, a little tentacle or whatever. It squirts the jelly cytoplasm. It pulls itself together and sticks a little arm out that way, okay? This projection holds the critter in place, and then the rest of the cell can follow, thus moving the organism forward. And so it squirts itself forward, and then it sucks the rest of its jelly towards that arm, and now it has moved forward one cell's length or whatever it is, and then it does it again, and it can move forward in that way. Okay? Now, what kind of jelly has to be inside this in order to do that? And how does that jelly move and squirt in one particular direction? Again, think in terms of pieces here. Every individual piece or function has to have a cause and a mechanism to make it happen. You can't just say, it happens, okay? So we can't just say, it has a pseudopod and move on. How does that work? How are you going to make that happen? On a microscopic scale, in a cell that has no muscles. Remember, you and I move by flexing our muscles, okay? These have no muscles. So how are you going to make it do this? All right, well, part of it is the jelly inside, right? The next one on this list here is ectoplasm, vitreous superficial layer of an amoeba. Vitreous just means jelly, kind of thick stuff. Ectoplasm. In certain organisms, such as an amoeba, the ectoplasm is the thin, transparent, somewhat rigid, contractile portion of the cytoplasm. Don't let the big words lose you here. It just says the jelly inside is what helps it move. The different consistencies of the endoplasm, which we get to in just a minute, and the ectoplasm aid in the formation of these pseudopods. Another function of ectoplasm in certain amoeba is for food ingestion. And so this outer layer, we look at the cell and it looks like a blob, but really that blob has a couple different layers of blobbiness inside of it. This jelly that's in there, it's not just, create some protein and dump it in a cell wall. First of all, it has no cell wall. But also, it's got layers, and if it did not have those different layers and different types of jelly inside the cell, then it couldn't move, right? It couldn't do that squirting thing. okay? Which brings us to the endoplasm. The endoplasm is the other part, the other type of jelly inside. Generally refers to the inner, often granulated, dense part of cell's cytoplasm. This is opposed to the ectoplasm, which is on the outer layer of the cytoplasm, which is typically watery and immediately adjacent to the plasma membrane. You getting all these pieces together? You have the membrane, and then the ecto, and then the endoplasm. Okay. These two terms mainly are used to describe the cytoplasm in the amoeba. The nucleus is separated from the endoplasm by the nuclear envelope. Okay, so we got a membrane on the outside. We got ectoplasm around that. Inside is endoplasm, and somehow these two interact to make this pod thing, but we have to protect the nucleus, which we'll get to later, by a separate membrane, which protects it and keeps it separate. Okay? Now, the amoeba cells locomote, they move by pseudopodia formation. The ectoplasm, the outer stuff of the amoeba cell, is responsible for changing the direction of the pseudopod, which way the arm shoots out. The location of the pseudopod changes when the alkalinity or the acidity, the pH. When the pH of the water changes, the ectoplasm changes as well. Somehow this jelly stuff inside has to be able to sense the pH of the water outside and then interact with what's in the cell to send out this little arm. A slight change in the acidity is enough for the flowing cytoplasm, which helps in locomotion. Water concentration of the amoeba cell is regulated also by the endoplasm. What? Endoplasm easily absorbs or releases water through the partially permeable membrane. So now we don't only have to worry about moving and all this other stuff, we have to worry about how much water is in the cell, and this jelly stuff also has to take care of that. Now, if you're making the cell, keep all these parts in mind, okay, because you're going to have to replicate this in the lab, okay? You're going to have to make these different jellies interact with each other in just such a way that the jelly can detect the pH of the water on the outside through the membrane, but not too much water can get into the cell through the membrane, or else bad things happen. We'll get to that in just a minute. So you have to regulate that as well. Keep that straight. Ectoplasm usually contains more actin filaments to support cell membrane for elasticity. More parts we have to worry about, some fibrous stuff to hold it all together. Ectoplasm protects the cell since it is in a gel-like state. Whew. Which brings us to the cell membrane. Y'all still with me here? Are we okay? You got this on mind? Because you're going to have to replicate this in the lab, right? Okay, here we go. Cell membrane. The cell membrane of an amoeba serves as an enclosure for all the contents of the cell and allows certain substances to move in and out of the cell. So it's not just like saran wrapping the goo inside, right? This has to be a special membrane on the outside. All cells have a cell membrane, which is called a plasma membrane. Because the cell membrane is thin and flexible, the amoeba has no set of shape or form, and it can go in all different kinds of shapes. The cell membrane also allows important molecules to pass in and out of the cell. Oxygen molecules can pass into the cell. Carbon dioxide, for example, can move out through the cell membrane. So however you design, you're going to have to design a membrane now, biochemically, to go around the cell, but it's got to know just what things to let into the cell and what things to let out. Because if it lets in the wrong things, the cell dies. If it lets out the wrong things, the cell dies. If the balance between the two different kinds of jelly don't work and it can't move, the cell what? The cell dies, yeah. If the nucleus isn't protected on the inside, the cell dies. Yeah, okay. Continuing on. Where are we at here? Cell membrane, blah, blah. Oh, contractile vacuole. Here we go. Again, this part as well, you're going to have to design. Try to figure out how you're going to put together a contractile vacuole and fit it into a single cell. Got it? Contractile vacuole is a complex osmoregulatory organelle of free-living amoebas which control the intracellular water balance by accumulating and expelling excess water out of the cell, allowing cells to survive under hypotonic stress as in pond water. We got all that? Cells have to, it's called osmolality, right? A certain balance of water and salts inside and outside the cell. Now, if you're a cell that's living in pond water, fresh water, all that water is going to want to come into the cell. But if too much water comes in, all your goo inside gets diluted and you tend to explode. and you die, okay? So you have to find a way to regulate just how much water is in and out. If too little water is inside, you dehydrate and you what? And you die, okay? So this is kind of complicated. So you have a membrane that has to take care of all this, and part of it is this contractile vacuole that helps regulate how much water goes in and comes out. In the absence of a functional contractile vacuole complex, in other words, if you don't have this thing or it's not working, cells cannot expel the water. They become highly swollen and they lyse. That's a fancy word for blow up. Okay, you're going to blow up if you drink too much water, if you're an amoeba. When cells are in isotonic medium, that is just the right concentration of salt water, the vacuole system doesn't do much. But when cells are placed in hypotonic medium, fresh water, the system is rapidly activated. The bladders fill with water and then fuse to the plasma membrane and discharge the contents. In other words, if this little thing in there says, uh-oh, we have too much water, it sucks it up and inflates, it attaches itself to the outside membrane, and then pushes that water out to get rid of the excess water in the cell. Now, if you're designing one of these vacuoles in a lab, you got to come up with this thing that A, can detect how much water is in your cell, B, knows how much water is on the outside and work with the pH and all that kind of stuff, has a way of sucking the excess water in without sucking in other valuable stuff, and then knows how to move to the outside of the cell and attach it there, and then is able to contract and squirt it back out into the pond water so that you don't die. Sounds simple enough, right? You all know how to do this now? You got the plans drawing up in your mind so you can recreate this? We got to move here, ladies and gentlemen. We got to fly. The food vacuole. The food vacuole is a membrane-enclosed sac which has a digestive function. It's present in unicellular protozoans like amoeba. They work as an intracellular stomach, digesting the ingested food. It contains digestive enzymes which break down the food, then is released into the cytoplasm for utilization. Here's this thing that has to, once you eat the food or once you absorb the food, it has to digest it. How you digest it? I mean, that's not, you don't just plop it in there and magically digest. You have to come up with a way for this to happen. Well, it has to happen with enzymes. Enzymes are fancy proteins that break down other things. Where do you get the proteins? This doesn't even cover that, but somehow you got to figure out how to manufacture those proteins and make a cell that manufactures its own proteins so it can survive. Then you have to put it all inside this vacuole. Then you have to make sure the food gets into the vacuole so it can digest, and then you have to figure out how that digested nutrients gets out to the rest of the cell and does what it needs to do. Simple, right? Everybody good? Continuing on, the clock is against me. The nucleus. The nucleus is the central hub of the cell, which contains all the genetics. It's responsible for making sure the cell regulates itself, but also is able to reproduce, right? So the genetics, we won't even go into all the DNA and stuff, how it rips apart, how it has to have the messenger RNA and stuff, and it recodes, and then it splits apart in mitosis and all these other kinds of fancy words that scientists throw around, which we don't care about. But it splits apart, it forms two sets of genetic material. Now this has to find a way not only to replicate itself inside, but also the nucleus has to split apart in a way that doesn't sever it, but it actually creates two separate nuclei, and then the cell has to find a way to cleave itself with one nuclei in each side. Then the cell itself can squeeze together. You have to come up with a mechanism for that without, again, rupturing itself to the open pond water, because that would kill it, but it has to then fuse and split, and now you have two amoebas. Now, we've just gone through a list of parts and pieces here. How many of you are ready to build one of those components that we talk about in the laboratory? Nobody? Not okay. Just a membrane. Who's ready to put together a membrane? Nobody. As we look at the complexity, and remember, this is one of the simplest cells. Okay, the simplest one I could think of. Even the most simple cell that is capable of sustaining life is extraordinarily complex. So problem number one I see with spontaneous evolution as far as the origin of life goes. And I'm sorry if I buried you in technical stuff today. That was kind of my design, though, because if you're not sitting at the end of that saying, blah, 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 I don't get it, That's the point, because it's super complex, right? So two problems, and we're going to cover the first one here, and we'll hit the next one next week with evolution. Problem number one, it is highly improbable. Again, all of these things coming together in a random fashion, all of these details, all these mechanisms, the enzymes, all the structures that are inside, all the pH balances, the sensing, all these organelles that are inside a cell that are extraordinarily complicated. To say that it happened by accident, I'm not convinced of that. I would say that if it's simple enough to have happened randomly in a puddle in ancient prehistoric Earth, the question is, why don't they just replicate it in a laboratory and show us how it's done? They can't do it. And all of the modern scientific knowledge, coupled with all the mass horsepower of technology that we've accumulated over the centuries, can't create the most simple living cell from scratch, from prehistoric molecules in a laboratory, even with guided intelligence to do it. Even if the smartest minds get together and try to create a cell in a laboratory with intelligent design by the scientist, they can't do it. But you're telling me that it could have happened randomly in a puddle. I find that hard to believe. I just find that hard to believe.